Have you ever had the feeling that something had to mean something, even without any concrete proof? That strange tightness in your chest when an answer doesn't come. The silence that seems to scream. A random detail that suddenly takes on enormous weight. Have you ever experienced this? Because the truth is that the human brain hates uncertainty, that he wasn't made to deal well with emptiness, with doubt, with maybe. And when reality doesn't provide clear answers, the mind does something unsettling. It creates its own explanations. It doesn't matter if they're true. What matters is that they make sense. At least for a moment. Perhaps you've already interpreted a glance as judgment, a delay as rejection, a coincidence as a sign, a completely random event as destiny. And the scariest thing isn't that it happens. The scariest thing is how often it happens. These interpretations seem real, while they are happening. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this process does not depend on faith, superstition, or lack of intelligence. It originates from the very architecture of the brain. When faced with uncertainty, the brain goes into a state of alert. Ambiguity generates discomfort. Lack of information becomes a threat. And to alleviate this tension, the mind begins to fill in the gaps with narratives, assumptions, and improvised meanings. It's almost automatic. Before you even realize it, a story has already been created. A conclusion has already been drawn. An emotion has already been activated. And then a silent problem arises. The more emotionally compelling the explanation, the more truthful it seems. The brain doesn't wait for evidence. It seeks relief. It prefers a wrong explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers a false meaning to the emptiness of doubt. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this mechanism completely changes the way you see your thoughts, your emotions, and even your most important decisions. Perhaps you are now recalling situations where the mind raced ahead of reality. A fear that grew without foundation. A certainty that was never questioned. A story that seemed obvious, until it proved false. Have you ever wondered how many times this happens without us realizing it? How many decisions are made not based on facts, but on the meanings that the brain invented to protect itself from uncertainty? This is one of the strangest and least noticed phenomena in the workings of the human mind. An invisible, silent, elegant error. A cognitive shortcut that once saved our ancestors, and that today creates anxiety, internal conflicts, and distorted interpretations of reality. It's not a character flaw. It's biology. It's neuroscience in action. Here, uncertainty is not just uncomfortable. It's fuel. An empty space that the brain feels compelled to fill. And it does so quickly. Without asking permission. Without checking the facts. As if saying, any meaning is better than none. And, in this process, the line between reality and interpretation begins to disappear. It is precisely in this nebulous territory, between what actually happens and what the mind constructs, that the essence of something is born. Dark human essence, not as a label, but as a deep investigation into the less obvious sides of the human mind. Those that we don't perceive while they are happening, but that shape everything. Now, before we continue, pay attention. If the brain is capable of transforming uncertainty into false meaning, what else might it be creating at this very moment without you realizing it? And to what extent is what you feel as truth merely a narrative well told by your own mind? It is from this question that we begin to move forward. And what comes next will make you look at your own thoughts in a different way. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, a specific situation has already come to mind. A moment when doubt prevailed. A silence that turned into certainty. A feeling that seemed so real it was never questioned. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below telling us what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes, putting it into words helps not only you organize your thoughts, but also other people who are experiencing the exact same thing without realizing it. This space isn't just for watching. It's for reflecting together. Each comment creates a real human exchange that expands this conversation far beyond the video. And when you like it, you're not just clicking a button. You're telling the algorithm that this type of content needs to reach more curious minds, more people who also deal with uncertainty, anxiety, and silent interpretations every day. If you feel that this type of research into the brain, the mind, and its less obvious aspects makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. This shows that you want to continue exploring these invisible layers of the human experience, video after video. Your participation here is what keeps this journey alive, consistent, and reaching those who need to hear it now. And stay with me, because understanding how the brain creates false meanings is just the beginning. From here, we're going to delve even deeper into this mechanism, and when you see how it really works, some old certainties may never seem as solid as before. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because understanding why the brain cannot tolerate emptiness. It completely changes the way you view your own thoughts. The human brain wasn't designed to wait. It was designed to survive for thousands of years. Hesitating too much could mean not noticing a predator, misinterpreting a sound in the forest, or not reacting in time to a threat. In this context, uncertainty was not neutral. It was dangerous. And this primitive logic still operates within us, even in a world where most threats are no longer physical but symbolic, emotional, and psychological. When information is lacking, the brain goes into a state of alert. Silence is not silence. Absence of data is not rest. Ambiguity is not calm. All of this generates internal tension. A discomfort difficult to explain but easy to feel. It's as if something is out of place. As if there were a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. And this feeling triggers an automatic process. The mind begins to look for meaning where perhaps there is none. This is where one of the greatest paradoxes of human experience arises. For the brain, not knowing is worse than being wrong. Making a mistake at least offers a story, a narrative, a temporary conclusion that reduces discomfort. But emptiness demands emotional tolerance, cognitive patience, mental maturity. And that costs energy. Much more than inventing a quick explanation. This is one of the great revelations behind many of the decisions we make every day. We don't choose what is most true. Often we choose what is most bearable. The brain prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers a fragile hypothesis to absolute silence. It prefers an emotionally coherent interpretation to the raw uncertainty of still incomplete pieces of evidence. And this mechanism doesn't only appear in extreme situations. It infiltrates the backstage of ordinary life. In interrupted conversations. In answers that don't come. In ambiguous glances. In subtle changes in behavior. In small coincidences that take on disproportionate weight. The brain connects the dots, creates patterns, constructs meanings. All this even before you realize you're interpreting, not observing. This is how absence becomes rejection. How a delay becomes disinterest. How a random event becomes a sign. How a coincidence becomes destiny. And in the midst of this process, something important happens. Emotion enters the scene. Because the brain doesn't just create meaning. It feels this meaning. And when something is felt intensely, it begins to seem true. Here begins a silent, almost invisible journey. The transformation of doubt into improvised certainty. Of uncertainty into narrative. Of emptiness into explanation. It's a path that seems logical on the inside, but often doesn't withstand deeper analysis. Yet, while it's happening, everything seems to make sense. Everything seems coherent. Everything seems obvious. This is the real impact of this mechanism on the human mindset. It shapes decisions, influences behaviors, guides choices, and even defines life paths. How many important decisions have stemmed from a hasty interpretation? How many personal truths have been built on assumptions never verified? How many emotions have been felt as absolute facts? The brain doesn't do this out of malice. It does it for efficiency. It saves cognitive effort. It reduces discomfort. It closes open stories. But the price of this can be high. Because in fleeing the void, the mind can distance itself from reality. By avoiding uncertainty, it can approach comfortable illusions. And at that point, the line between perception and truth begins to blur. There is something profoundly human in this process. We don't like to be left in suspense. We want answers. We want clarity. We want meaning. And when the world doesn't deliver that immediately, the mind takes control of the narrative. It creates invisible backstage events. Internal revelations. Conclusions that seem solid, but which were born only from the need to relieve tension. This mechanism explains why so many people defend ideas with such conviction even without solid evidence. It explains why certain beliefs resist facts. It explains why changing your mind hurts. Because often, abandoning a wrong explanation means returning to emptiness, and the brain hates that. Uncertainty demands emotional maturity. It requires a rare attitude, the ability to say, "I don't know yet," without collapsing internally. It requires accepting that not everything has immediate meaning. That not every absence carries a message. That not every feeling points to a truth. This is a skill that is rarely practiced, but essential for those seeking mental clarity, more conscious decisions, and a more honest relationship with their own mind. And the more we observe this mechanism in action, the more we realize how much it operates behind the scenes of our personal journey. It influences relationships, expectations, fears, ambitions. It shapes how we interpret the past and anticipate the future. It creates a real impact on the way we live, even when it goes completely unnoticed. Therefore, looking at how this process works is not just a scientific curiosity. It's an invitation to transform our mindset, an invitation to slow down interpretations, to question certainties that are too quick, to realize when the brain is simply trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing. And perhaps, while all of this makes sense to you now, some word is resonating more strongly. Uncertainty, emptiness, meaning. If you want, comment below with a simple phrase, "That makes sense to me." Because recognizing this mechanism is already the first step in understanding what happens even before you realize that something needed to mean something. When real information doesn't arrive, the brain doesn't go into standby mode. It doesn't remain silent. It doesn't accept emptiness as something neutral. On the contrary, it reacts. This is the hidden mechanism that operates all the time behind the scenes of the human mind. Faced with gaps, the brain creates meaning. Not because that meaning exists, but because its absence generates tension. The void is too uncomfortable to be kept open. The human brain is designed to anticipate, interpret, and act. It wasn't made to live for long with, "I don't know." When something is left open-ended, when information is missing, when a situation doesn't explain itself, the mind goes into active mode. And this movement happens quickly. So quickly that, most of the time, you don't even realize you're interpreting, you just feel that you understood. This process begins subtly. A slight discomfort arises. Something doesn't quite fit. Something seems incomplete. And then the brain does what it does best. It connects the dots. Even if those dots aren't actually connected. It creates an imaginary bridge between loose ends. Not to discover the truth, but to alleviate the feeling of instability. The goal isn't precision. It's inner balance. This is how quick narratives emerge. Improvised stories that make emotional sense, even though they haven't undergone any kind of verification. The brain doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Does this explain it?" If the answer is yes, the narrative is accepted. Meaning comes before checking. Always. Because checking requires time, patience, and cognitive energy. Creating an immediate explanation requires only association and emotion. Think of something extremely simple and everyday, a sent message that goes unanswered. The cell phone is there. The screen remains off. No notifications. No reply. Technically, this means nothing. The person might be busy, have no signal, be distracted, or be sleeping. But the brain doesn't like this open field. It senses the gap. And almost instantly, it begins to fill it. I said something wrong. They lost interest. They're ignoring me. In a few seconds, emptiness turned into meaning. And that meaning begins to generate emotion. Anxiety. Sadness. Irritation. The most curious thing is that, at this point, emotion begins to function as proof. If it hurts, it seems real. If it bothers you, it seems true. The brain confuses emotional intensity with evidence. The same thing happens with a strange look, a microgesture, a neutral expression, a silence during a conversation. The brain doesn't have enough data to interpret it clearly, so it looks for internal references. Old memories, past insecurities, similar experiences. It creates a story that explains the current discomfort, even if that story has no external confirmation. Still, it settles in as if it were obvious. Random events follow exactly the same path. Coincidences gain weight. Fortuitous sequences seem like signs. An isolated event comes to be seen as part of something bigger. The brain loves patterns. It has been trained to find them because recognizing patterns has always been an evolutionary advantage. But when there is no real pattern, it doesn't give up. It invents one. This is a crucial point in this mental journey. The brain doesn't differentiate well between a real connection and an emotionally satisfying connection. If the narrative reduces tension, it is accepted. If it fills the gap, it is incorporated. If it gives meaning to discomfort, it becomes a reference point. Fact-checking takes a back seat when it is not completely ignored. And little by little, this mechanism begins to shape something bigger, the way we interpret the world. Each new ambiguous situation is filtered through previous narratives. Each new emotion reinforces old stories. Each interpretation confirms the previous one. Thus, a meaning invented in a moment of uncertainty can, over time, become a solid personal truth. Not because it was tested, but because it was felt repeatedly. This is how beliefs are formed. This is how fragile certainties gain strength. This is how important decisions are made based on unverified assumptions. The brain creates an internal map of reality that seems coherent on the inside, even if it doesn't fully correspond to what happens on the outside. This mechanism has a direct impact on the decisions we make, the mindset we develop, and how we react to situations. It operates behind the scenes of our journey, silently adjusting the lens through which we see everything. And the less aware we are of it, the more automatic it becomes. Faster. More invisible. There is something profoundly human in this process. We don't like blank spaces. We want explanations. We want closure. We want to understand what is happening, even when there isn't enough data to do so. And in this impulse, the mind takes on the role of narrator. It constructs stories to protect us from the emotional instability that emptiness provokes. But this protection comes at a cost. Because in filling gaps with meaning, the brain can stray from reality. It can transform hypotheses into truths, sensations into facts, emotions into conclusions. And when this happens repeatedly, the boundary between what is observed and what is interpreted begins to blur. Perhaps now you're realizing how many times this has happened to you. How many stories began with a lack of information. How many emotions arose not from what happened, but from the meaning created to explain what was missing. How many certainties emerged without ever having been truly questioned. This is the heart of the phenomenon. The brain cannot tolerate gaps. It fills them with meaning. Even if that meaning is provisional. Even if it is imprecise. Even if it is false. And understanding this is fundamental, because from here it begins to become clear how these narratives consolidate, strengthen, and begin to direct our reactions almost automatically. Now, while all of this falls into place, consider this. The brain doesn't do this because it's flawed, but because it's efficient within the logic of survival. The problem is that the world has changed, but the mechanism continues to operate in the same way. And that's precisely where interpretations begin to gain more power than facts. If this idea resonated with you, leave a simple comment below. That makes sense to me. Because recognizing this mechanism in action is already the first step in understanding what happens even before you realize that something needed to mean something. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is precisely where the real danger lies. When the meaning is false but it seems absolutely true. The brain doesn't work with raw facts all the time. It works with internal experiences, sensations, emotions. And when an interpretation provokes an intense emotional reaction, it gains special weight. A weight that closely resembles truth. Not because it has been proven, but because it has been felt. And for the brain, what is felt strongly comes to be treated as real. Emotion acts as a seal of authenticity. The stronger it is, the more convincing the story becomes. Anxiety transforms assumption into threat. Fear transforms hypothesis into certainty. Sadness transforms absence into rejection. Anger transforms interpretation into accusation. The brain doesn't make this distinction clearly because it wasn't designed for it. It was designed to react quickly, not to investigate deeply. This is where a silent but powerful confusion arises. The brain begins to treat emotional meaning as fact that if something hits hard, if it has an internal impact, if it generates an intense reaction, it automatically seems true. The mind doesn't ask, did this happen? It asks, how does this make me feel? And from there, it constructs an internal reality consistent with that emotion. This mechanism explains why so many people defend ideas with conviction even when they can't explain where they came from. It explains why certain certainties seem unshakable. It explains why changing your mind hurts. Because often, abandoning an interpretation is not just changing your mind, it's tampering with something that has been felt to be true. Think about how many important decisions have been made in that state. Choices made in the heat of the moment. Paths followed because they seemed right. Relationships interrupted by interpretations never confirmed. Fears fueled by internal narratives that were never tested. The impact of this on someone's personal journey is enormous, even when it goes unnoticed. The brain creates a story. Emotion validates that story. And from then on, everything that happens is filtered to confirm that version. Contrary information is ignored. Ambiguous details are reinterpreted. The false meaning is strengthened not because it is true, but because it is emotionally consistent. That is how it sustains itself. There is something profoundly seductive about this process. Emotions give a sense of clarity, of certainty, of closure. They offer an immediate answer to internal confusion. And the brain likes that. It likes to close cycles, conclude stories, reduce ambiguity. Even if, to do so, it needs to distort reality. This dynamic happens behind the scenes of the mind all the time. In automatic thoughts, in quick judgments, in impulsive reactions, in certainties that arise without warning. Most people don't realize when this is happening because everything seems logical internally. The narrative makes sense. The emotion confirms it. And that's enough. But here's an important revelation from this journey. Feeling that something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. This phrase seems simple, but it goes against a very strong impulse of the human mind. We have been taught to trust what we feel, to follow our intuition, to believe in our gut feeling. And while this has its value, it can also be a powerful trap when left unquestioned. The brain doesn't clearly differentiate between an emotion generated by a real event and an emotion generated by a misinterpretation. For it, emotion is emotion. Reaction is reaction. And this creates a gray area where external truth loses ground to internal coherence. What matters is not what happened, but what was felt based on what is believed to have happened. This is a critical point in the transformation of mindset. Because as long as we don't perceive this confusion, we continue reacting to internal narratives as if they were objective facts. We continue making decisions based on invented meanings. We continue reinforcing beliefs that arose solely from the need to alleviate the discomfort of uncertainty. And the longer an emotional narrative remains active, the harder it becomes to dismantle it. It integrates into one's identity. It becomes part of how the person sees themselves and the world. Questioning it seems threatening. Because questioning that story means opening space for emptiness again. It means admitting that perhaps one doesn't know. And the brain strongly resists that. This is one of the reasons why this mechanism has such a profound impact on human decisions. It doesn't just act in isolated moments. It influences behavioral patterns. It shapes expectations. It directs choices. It builds an internal logic that seems solid, but which may be based on fragile premises. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed. Many of our strongest certainties were born not from reality, but from emotion. They were born in moments of vulnerability, uncertainty, or fear. They were embraced because they relieved tension. And they remained because they were never questioned. Observing this isn't comfortable. But it's liberating. Because when we begin to perceive the difference between fact and emotional meaning, something changes. The reaction slows down. The interpretation loses power. The mind gains space. A new possibility emerges, that of not reacting immediately to what seems obvious. This awareness doesn't eliminate emotions. It doesn't block feelings. But it creates a healthy distance between what is felt and what is accepted as truth. And it is precisely in this space that a real transformation begins in the way we deal with thoughts, decisions, and relationships. Perhaps you're now recalling situations where a strong emotion guided your perception. Moments when something seemed so real that it was never questioned. If this resonated with you, write a simple sentence in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Because recognizing this point already sets the stage for understanding how these narratives become established, and how they begin to lose strength when brought to light. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we're talking about doesn't just happen in extreme moments or rare situations. On the contrary, this happens all the time, every day, in such subtle ways that they go completely unnoticed. And that's precisely why the impact is so great. Think about the most common superstitions. Knocking on wood. Avoiding certain numbers. Repeating small rituals before important decisions. Deep down, almost everyone knows there's no real relationship between the gesture and the result. But the brain creates a symbolic connection. A comforting meaning. Something that gives a sense of control amidst uncertainty. It's not logic. It's emotional relief. It's the brain saying, if I do this, I'll be less uncomfortable. And that feeling is enough to keep the narrative alive. Coincidences follow the same pattern. Two events close in time that, rationally, have no relation whatsoever. Yet, the brain connects the dots. This can't be by chance. There's something behind it. It's a sign. The meaning comes quickly, almost automatically. And the more the coincidence touches something important, a decision, a fear, a desire, the stronger it seems. Emotion amplifies the connection. What was merely random gains symbolic weight. It gains history. It gains meaning. In relationships, this mechanism becomes even more intense. A different tone of voice. A shorter response. A delay in replying to a message. Slightly unusual behavior. All of this creates small gaps in information. And the brain immediately springs into action. It doesn't wait. It interprets. Something has changed. I did something wrong. There's someone else. Often none of these stories are true. But they seem real because they arise accompanied by emotion. Insecurity. Fear of rejection. Anxiety. And once again, the brain confuses what is felt with what is factual. The most dangerous thing is that these interpretations are rarely checked. They are assumed to be true and begin to guide behavior. The person shuts down. Reacts defensively. Creates distance. And, ironically, ends up provoking exactly the result they feared. The invented meaning begins to shape reality. Not because it was right, but because it was believed. Fears created from a lack of information work the same way. A medical exam that takes a long time to come back. Silence after an interview. A vague answer to an important question. The brain can't stand being left in the dark. It anticipates scenarios, usually the worst ones. Not because they are more likely, but because they are emotionally intense. Anxiety gives a sense of preparedness, as if suffering beforehand were a way to protect oneself afterward. These examples are so common that almost no one questions them. They are part of our mental routine, of the automatic way we interpret the world. And that's exactly why this mechanism is so powerful. It doesn't present itself as an error. It presents itself as intuition, as keen perception, as an emotional reading of reality, when, in fact, it is often just the brain trying to fill in the gaps too quickly. The impact of this on someone's personal journey is profound. Small interpretations accumulated over time shape beliefs, expectations, and decisions. They influence the mindset with which a person faces challenges, opportunities, and relationships. They create invisible filters that distort how reality is perceived. And the sooner these narratives take hold, the more natural they seem. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed openly. Much of what we believe about the world doesn't stem from facts, but from the stories we create to cope with uncertainty. Stories that eased discomfort at some point in life. Stories that made emotional sense. Stories that were never revisited calmly. This process happens behind the scenes of the mind, silently. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't warn. It simply operates. And when we realize it, we are already reacting to a world filtered through meanings that may never have been real. This affects professional decisions, personal choices, relationships, self-confidence. It affects how we interpret failures and successes. It affects how we see ourselves. It is precisely this type of phenomenon, everyday, invisible, and profoundly human, that reveals how ingenious and treacherous the mind can be at the same time. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science, not out of superficial curiosity, but as a serious investigation into how these mechanisms shape our experience without us even realizing it. When we begin to see these patterns, something changes. Not because we stop feeling, but because we begin to observe. The reaction loses some of its speed. The interpretation ceases to be automatic. A space emerges between the stimulus and the conclusion. And this space is transformative. It is in this space that new decisions can be born. Decisions that are less impulsive, less guided by old narratives, more aligned with what is really happening. But this awareness doesn't appear all at once. It's built up little by little, by observing small episodes in daily life, by questioning quick certainties, by noticing when a strong emotion arises without a clear fact to support it. This is an inner journey, a change of mindset that begins silently but generates real impact over time. Perhaps, as you listen to all this, several situations have already come to mind. Small moments where an interpretation gained more weight than the facts. Coincidences that seemed like signs. Fears born from silence. If this resonated with you, write a simple sentence in the comments. This has happened to me before. Because recognizing these patterns is the first step in understanding how they continue to operate, and how, little by little, they can begin to lose control over how you interpret the world. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we look at all of this from a little more distance, an uncomfortable question begins to arise. If this mechanism is so flawed, why does it continue to happen so frequently? The answer has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence, lack of education, or lack of critical thinking. It has to do with something much more basic. Something biological. There's a silent cognitive error operating behind all of this. A bias as old as the human brain itself. The mind prefers a bad explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers something imperfect, incomplete, or even wrong to remaining in the void of uncertainty. And this isn't a conscious choice. It's an automatic reflex. The brain doesn't wake up in the morning deciding to distort reality. It simply follows a pattern that has been reinforced over thousands of years. In hostile environments, waiting too long could cost a life. Questioning too much could be dangerous. Creating a quick explanation, even if inaccurate, was better than being paralyzed. This pattern became ingrained. And today it continues to operate even when the context has completely changed. That's why it's so important to understand. It's not stupidity, it's not a lack of intellectual capacity. It's not naivete. It's biology. It's a survival system functioning in a world where threats are no longer physical, but symbolic, emotional, and social. The brain applies the same old logic to modern situations, and that's where the internal conflicts begin. This process happens below the level of consciousness. By the time you realize it, the explanation has already been created. The interpretation is already formed. Emotion has already taken over. There was no deep rational analysis. There was no comparison of hypotheses. There was only an automatic response to the discomfort of not knowing. And this happens to everyone, including extremely intelligent, analytical, and experienced people. Even intelligent people fall for this every day. Because intelligence doesn't deactivate biological reflexes. Knowledge doesn't prevent automatic reactions. Critical thinking helps later when there's room for reflection. But in the initial moment, the emotional brain takes control, trying to restore internal balance as quickly as possible. This cognitive error has a huge impact on how we construct our mindset. It influences how we interpret ambiguous situations, how we react to challenges, and how we make important decisions. Many choices that seem rational actually stemmed from quick explanations created to relieve emotional tension. Only later were they rationalized, organized, and justified. There's a hidden truth here that we don't always like to admit. A large part of our convictions did not arise from the analysis of facts, but from the need to feel secure. The explanation came first. The justification came later. And over time, the story solidified until it seemed like an absolute truth. The brain hates being in suspense. It hates maybe. It hates I don't know yet. These states require emotional tolerance, cognitive patience, and psychological maturity. These are skills that are not frequently stimulated. On the contrary, we live in a world that demands quick answers, immediate positions, and strong opinions. And this further reinforces this cognitive error. Behind the scenes of the mind, the process is simple. A gap appears, discomfort arises, an explanation is created. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. What matters is that it closes the story. What matters is that it reduces anxiety. What matters is that it restores the feeling of control. The mind calms down, and this is interpreted as a sign that the explanation was correct. This is a crucial point in the journey of personal transformation. Because as long as we don't recognize this pattern, we continue to believe that our interpretations are direct reflections of reality. We continue to blindly trust the stories that the mind creates. We continue to make decisions based on internal narratives that have never truly been examined. When we begin to see this cognitive error in action, something changes. Not abruptly but gradually. The reaction slows down. Immediate certainty loses its power. A pause emerges. A small space between the stimulus and the interpretation. And this space is powerful. It is in this space that consciousness begins to enter the scene. This is not an invitation to doubt everything all the time. It's not about paralyzing decisions or living in perpetual uncertainty. It's about recognizing that the first meaning that comes to mind isn't always reliable. It's about understanding that the brain may simply be trying to protect itself from discomfort. It's about gaining the freedom to question without fear. This change in mindset has a real impact. It affects relationships, career choices, self-awareness. It affects how we deal with mistakes, frustrations, and expectations. When we understand that the brain prefers any explanation to emptiness, we begin to distrust certainties that are too quick to appear. And that's healthy. Because truth rarely emerges on impulse. It usually appears when there is room for observation. When there is enough silence to discern what is fact and what is merely interpretation. When there is a willingness to hold on to, I don't know, for a few more moments. This cognitive error isn't going away. It's part of the structure of the human mind. But it can be observed. And everything that is observed loses some of its automatic power. From there, a new phase of the journey begins. A phase in which the brain still creates stories, but you start to notice when that happens. Perhaps now, as all of this falls into place, you're remembering situations where a quick explanation was accepted without question. Moments when an internal narrative guided important decisions. If this resonated with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Because recognizing this mistake is the first step in understanding how it manifests itself in even more subtle ways. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to get even deeper. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we observe all of this carefully, a disconcerting realization emerges. This mechanism fools so many people because it works so well. It is efficient. It is comfortable. And, above all, it is internally rewarded by the brain itself. Narratives bring emotional relief. That's the key. When a story forms in the mind, even if it's fragile, incomplete, or false, something calms down inside. The tension decreases. The discomfort of uncertainty loses its power. The brain feels it has solved the problem. And this feeling of resolution generates a small, almost imperceptible chemical relief, but enough to reinforce the behavior. The mind learns quickly, creating meaning hurts less than sustaining emptiness. That's why stories are so powerful. They organize chaos. They give a beginning, middle, and end to confusing experiences. They transform loose events into something comprehensible. Even when they aren't true, they offer structure. And the brain loves structure. It feels safer when everything seems to fit together, when reality seems coherent, when there are no loose ends threatening the feeling of control. The mind rewards those who close the story. When an interpretation emerges and seems to explain everything, the brain reacts as if it had accomplished a task. Mission accomplished. Problem solved. It doesn't matter if the solution is correct. What matters is that it is satisfactory. The brain doesn't distribute rewards based on objective truth, but on the reduction of internal discomfort. This is a crucial detail of this journey. The brain does not seek truth as an absolute priority, that he seeks stability. He seeks predictability. He seeks emotional comfort. The truth, when uncertain, ambiguous, or uncomfortable, gives way to simpler, quicker, and more pleasant narratives to sustain. Questioning requires energy. Accepting is easier. This is another point that explains why so many people fall into this trap. Questioning an interpretation means reopening the story. It means admitting that perhaps the explanation isn't so solid. It means returning to a state of doubt. And this consumes mental resources, attention, time, cognitive effort. The brain, which always tries to conserve energy, prefers to avoid this expenditure. Accepting the first explanation that comes along is more efficient. It doesn't require deep reflection. It doesn't require internal confrontation. It doesn't require tolerating the discomfort of not knowing. The mind simply moves forward, carrying that narrative as if it were a fact. And the more often this happens, the more natural this path becomes. This process silently shapes one's mindset. Gradually, the person begins to trust the stories they feel more than the facts they observe. They start reacting more to interpretations than to the events themselves. They begin to make decisions based on what seems true, not necessarily on what is verifiable. And this has a huge impact on daily life. Behind the scenes of this dynamic, a constant exchange is taking place. The brain trades truth for comfort. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because immediate comfort seems more urgent. The truth can wait. Emotion cannot. Tension needs to be resolved now. And narrative offers that instant resolution. That's why flimsy theories can seem so convincing. Why simplistic explanations gain so much traction. Why absolute certainties spread so easily. They offer relief. They close stories. They eliminate ambiguity. They give the feeling that everything makes sense, even when it doesn't. This mechanism also explains why changing one's mind is so difficult. When a narrative has already brought emotional relief in the past, abandoning it feels like a threat. It means losing that comfort. It means reopening a story that was resolved. It means returning to the original discomfort. The brain strongly resists this because it associates that narrative with a feeling of security. Throughout life, we accumulate countless stories of this kind. Small explanations created in moments of doubt. Interpretations made under emotion. Meanings quickly assigned to relieve tension. Over time, these stories become integrated into our identity. They become part of how a person sees the world, others, and themselves. Questioning them is not just revising an idea. It's tampering with something that sustains our sense of inner stability. This is one of the most important revelations from this conversation. What deceives is not a lack of intelligence, but the emotional efficiency of the error. The brain is not naive. It is strategic within the logic of emotional survival. It chooses the path that hurts the least now, even if it generates distortions later. When we begin to see this clearly, something changes. Not dramatically but gradually. The person starts to notice when an explanation comes too quickly. When a certainty is accompanied by intense emotion. When a story seems too good to be questioned. This simple act of noticing already creates a crack in the automatic pattern. The transformation begins at this point. In the willingness to hold on to doubt for a few more moments. To not close the story immediately. To allow reality to remain open while more information is pending. This stance requires emotional maturity. It requires energy. But it also brings something rare, inner freedom. Because when the brain no longer needs to hastily piece together all the narratives, decisions begin to change. Reactions slow down. Interpretations become less rigid. Space emerges for nuances. For complexity. For the possibility that not everything has a hidden meaning waiting to be deciphered. This change in mindset doesn't eliminate emotions, nor does it prevent interpretations. But it creates awareness of the process. And awareness changes everything. It reveals the inner workings of one's own reactions. It shows when comfort is being prioritized over truth. And little by little, it allows for choices that are more aligned with what is really happening, not just with what seems comforting. Perhaps now you're realizing how many times a narrative was accepted simply because it brought relief. How many certainties were maintained because questioning them seemed too exhausting. If this made sense to you, leave a simple comment below. That makes sense to me. Because recognizing this point opens the door to understanding the invisible cost of these internal choices. And that's exactly where this journey begins to take on even greater significance. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because up to this point we've talked about how the brain creates meaning because they look real, and why do so many people fall for this? But there is an even more delicate layer, almost always ignored, the invisible cost of believing in these false meanings, a cost that doesn't appear immediately but accumulates silently over time. When the brain accepts an unverified narrative, it doesn't remain isolated. It begins to influence decisions. Small at first, almost imperceptible. A choice here, a behavior there. A subtle distancing. A word left unsaid. A defensive attitude that arises for no apparent reason. And, before you know it, an important decision has already been made based on something that was never real. Wrong decisions rarely seem wrong at the moment they are made. They seem consistent with the internal narrative that is active. If the brain believes it is being rejected, it decides to protect itself. If it believes there is danger, it decides to avoid. If it believes something will go wrong, it decides to retreat. The problem is not the decision itself, it is the invisible premise that underpins it. A premise built from an interpretation, not from a fact. This is a central point of this journey. The brain acts as if meaning were reality, and when the meaning is false, decisions follow the same path. People shy away from opportunities thinking they are incapable. They give up on important conversations believing they already know the answer. They sabotage relationships out of fear of something that has never happened. All of this seems logical internally, but produces real consequences externally. Unnecessary fears arise precisely from this process. Fear rarely stems from what is happening now. It arises from what the brain imagines might be happening. From what could go wrong. From what makes sense to fear. When a false narrative takes hold, fear becomes constant. The mind begins to scan the environment for confirmation. Any detail becomes proof. Any ambiguity becomes a threat. And this continuous state of alert takes a heavy psychological toll. The body reacts. Anxiety increases. Rest decreases. The mind becomes too busy trying to predict scenarios. Emotional suffering begins to seem like a natural part of life, when in reality it is sustained by internal narratives that are never questioned. Stories that were born simply from the need to fill a void. Conflicts created out of thin air are another common effect of this mechanism. A misinterpretation turns into resentment. Silence becomes internal accusation. Neutral behavior becomes attack. And when these emotions are not clearly communicated, they transform into accumulated tension. The person reacts in a cold, defensive, or aggressive way, and the other doesn't understand why. The conflict arises without a real cause but with a real impact. The cruelest part is that these conflicts seem to confirm the original narrative. See? I knew it. The brain uses the result of its own behavior as proof that it was right from the beginning. A cycle closes. The story is strengthened. And the chance of revision diminishes even further. It all started with a false interpretation, but ends with true consequences. This is avoidable emotional suffering. Avoidable because it doesn't stem from objective events, but from constructed meanings. Avoidable because it could be reduced with more awareness of the process. Avoidable because it doesn't require changing the world, it requires observing the mind. Yet, it spreads silently because no one teaches how to differentiate emotion from fact, narrative from reality, interpretation from evidence. Over time, this invisible cost shapes a person's mindset. They begin to see the world as more hostile than it really is. Relationships as more dangerous. Decisions as riskier. Their very identity begins to organize itself around these narratives. I am like this. Things always end this way. People always do this. Absolute truths built on fragile foundations. There is a hidden truth here that is almost never spoken. Much of human suffering stems not from what happens, but from the meaning attributed to what happens. Two individuals can experience the same external situation and yet have completely different internal realities, depending on the narrative that the brain constructs. And that changes everything. Behind the scenes of the mind, this process operates tirelessly. It doesn't wait for permission. It simply connects, interprets, and reacts. And as long as it goes unnoticed, it continues to produce an impact. An impact on choices. An impact on relationships. An impact on how a person treats and interacts with others. An impact on the entire journey. When we begin to see this invisible cost, something shifts internally. It's not guilt. It's not judgment. It's clarity. Clarity that much pain could have been less. That many conflicts didn't need to exist. That many decisions could have been different if the meaning had been questioned before being accepted as truth. This awareness doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it reduces their automatic repetition. It creates a space between stimulus and reaction. A space where the question begins to emerge, is this a fact or a story? And this simple, silent question has enormous transformative power. Because when the brain begins to perceive the cost of its own narratives, it starts to hesitate a little before accepting them. Immediate certainty loses its power. Emotion still arises, but it doesn't dominate everything. The mind begins to tolerate emptiness better. And this completely changes the way meanings are constructed. Perhaps you are now recognizing situations from your own life. Decisions that seem strange today. Fears that never made much sense. Conflicts that could have been avoided. If this resonated with you, write a simple sentence in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Because recognizing the invisible cost is what prepares the ground for understanding something even deeper. How these narratives can be dismantled when they are finally brought to light. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've seen so far converges on a central point that completely changes how you relate to your own mind. Consciousness is mental freedom. Not freedom in the abstract sense, but something very concrete, lived day to day, in the small internal pauses that begin to emerge when you realize what is happening inside. Uncertainty is not the enemy. It never has been. The problem is that the brain has learned, throughout evolution, to treat it as if it were. As if every void needed to be filled. As if every ambiguity hid a threat. But, in the world we live in today, this logic exacts too high a price. What once protected us now confuses us. What once accelerated decisions now distorts perceptions. When you begin to see this, something subtle happens. Your relationship with doubt changes. It ceases to be an automatic trigger for anxiety and becomes a temporary space for observation. Pause. A place where nothing needs to be decided immediately. And that, in itself, is already a profound transformation of mindset. Learning to pause before interpreting changes everything. It's not an external, visible pause. It's internal. One extra second before closing the story. A small delay between the stimulus and the conclusion. In that minimal space, the brain stops operating in reflex mode and begins, albeit timidly, to operate in conscious mode. And that difference is enormous. Because when you pause, you realize something important. The emotion is still there, but it doesn't need to control the narrative. The discomfort still exists, but it doesn't demand an immediate explanation. The mind continues trying to fill the void, but now someone is observing this movement. And everything that is observed loses its automatic power. This is true mental freedom. It's not about stopping feeling. It's not about eliminating thoughts. It's about not being swept away by them on impulse. It's about recognizing that not every feeling needs to become certainty. That not every interpretation needs to become truth. That not every internal story needs to be adopted as reality. Not everything needs to have immediate meaning. This idea goes against a deep-seated impulse of the brain, but it opens up a huge space of relief. Because it means you don't need to solve everything right now. You don't need to understand everything right now. You don't need to explain everything right now. Some things can simply remain suspended, without threat, without urgency, without drama. This point is crucial in anyone's psychological journey. When the mind accepts that it may not know for a while, it reorganizes itself. Anxiety decreases. Rigidity falls away. Perception becomes more flexible. And, interestingly, it is in this state that interpretations tend to become more accurate, not less. There is a hidden truth in all of this. Clarity doesn't come from haste, it comes from space. An inner space for observation. For feeling without concluding. For perceiving without labeling. This space doesn't arise naturally, it needs to be cultivated. And it begins precisely the moment you realize your brain is trying to close a story too quickly. This awareness changes the way you make decisions. Instead of reacting, you choose. Instead of assuming, you observe. Instead of believing immediately, you consider possibilities. This doesn't slow down life. It makes life more aligned. Less guided by invisible fears. Less shaped by automatic narratives. Over time, this attitude generates real impact. Relationships become more honest because they are no longer guided by unspoken assumptions. Conflicts diminish because hasty interpretations lose their power. Emotional suffering reduces, not because life has become perfect, but because fewer false narratives are being perpetuated. This change also transforms how you see yourself. Many identities are built on meanings that have never been questioned. I am like this. This always happens to me. People always do this. When these phrases begin to be seen as narratives, and not as absolute truths, something loosens inside. Identity becomes lighter, less rigid, more open to new experiences. Behind the scenes of this transformation, the brain learns something new. It can tolerate emptiness. It can sustain "I don't know." It can coexist with ambiguity without collapsing. And that is a powerful lesson. Because the fear of uncertainty diminishes when it ceases to be treated as a threat. This isn't an instant change. It's an internal, daily, almost silent practice. Noticing when a strong emotion arises without a clear explanation. Recognizing when an explanation appears too quickly. Acknowledging when the mind is trying to trade truth for comfort. Each time this is observed, the automatic response loses a little more control. And little by little, life begins to be lived from a different place. Less reactive, less defensive, more conscious, more curious, more open. Reality ceases to be something that needs to be constantly explained and becomes something that can be observed more calmly. Perhaps this is one of the greatest paradoxes of the human mind. What scares the brain most isn't the actual danger. It's simply not knowing. But when you learn to remain in that state of uncertainty for a few more moments, you discover something unexpected. It's not an abyss. It's a space. And it is precisely from this space that a freer way of thinking, feeling, and deciding is born. If all of this resonated with you in some way, write a simple sentence in the comments. That makes sense to me. Because recognizing this point doesn't end anything. It merely opens the way to understanding with even greater depth what happens when you truly begin to dismantle the stories that the mind creates to protect itself. If you've made it this far, it's because something along the way resonated with you. Perhaps not as a definitive answer, but as a question that kept echoing. And that says a lot. This kind of reflection isn't about agreeing with everything, it's about to look inward and notice movements that previously went unnoticed. If you've stayed with me until the end of this conversation, leave a simple comment just so I know you were really here with me. It could be something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." Sometimes writing this is also a way of internally marking that something has changed, even if only a little. If at any point you felt that silent connection, when an idea clicks, when a perception aligns, consider liking the video. Not as a mechanical gesture, but as a sign that this exchange was worthwhile, that this type of content has room to continue existing and evolving. And if you feel that this deeper look into the mind, perception, and the inner workings of human behavior makes sense for your journey, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this conversation. Here, the idea has never been to provide ready-made answers, but to open spaces of awareness that stay with you long after the video ends. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. It delves into another layer of this same phenomenon, in a different but connected way. Click there and continue watching. Because ultimately, it all begins with the same question that opened this path. How many times does the mind create meanings just to avoid facing the void? And how many truths have you already accepted simply to avoid remaining for a few more seconds, in the discomfort of not knowing? This is dark human science. Where perception is not reality.